Good evening. Can you hear me okay? I'm Franck Salameh from the Department of Eastern, Slavic, and German Studies. And I've been tasked with introducing this evening's panel. But I'm going to use this opportunity to say a few things. Because I was here about a year ago, like tonight. It was a few days after the beginning of the hostilities, a few days after the beginning of the war on Ukraine. And I can't help thinking of that evening because I really thought at that time that this was going to be the one and only panel on the war in Ukraine, and that thing was going to blow over and there'll be a resolution, and that was it. I didn't really imagine that on the eve of the one-year anniversary would be meeting again with almost the same panelists as last year. Back then, the panelists were still speaking in terms of skirmishes. Some of us, myself included, were still speaking in terms of Russian disorientation, soldiers who didn't know where they were, columns of military transport losing their way on the road to Ukraine. That kind of reminded me of stories that my own father-in-law, who's French from Champagne, from northern France, and he would tell stories as a little kid during the Nazi invasion, how teenagers, little kids, 10, 11-year-olds would be hiding in ditches and would be turning signs around like towards Germany as the tanks were entering France to sort of disorient the Nazis. And that image of, all seen them on TV, tanks broken down, running out of fuel. It was kind of a joke initially, and Ukrainians sort of bantering with what looked like dorky Russian soldiers. That turned out to be fleeting. The panelists, among them my colleague from political science, Professor Gerald Easter, who's also here this evening. Many panelists back then, although realistic and clear-eyed about the seriousness of that war and the repercussions it was bound to have around the world, back then they seemed still clinging to some hope that things would blow over and a resolution would be hammered out in no time. Yet, here we are, 1 year later, hundreds of thousands of dead on both sides, of yet again shifting European borders, belligerents and co-belligerents no longer limited to Russians and Ukrainians alone, but some people coming from my own universe. There are Syrians and Iranians and international narco-terrorist group Hezbollah joining the fray on the side of Russia, and NATO states as well as the United States fighting vicariously alongside the Ukrainians. So long introduction to say a year in and things seem to be turning for the worse. But you're not here to listen to my recollections and speculations and lamentations. And like you, I'm here to let my colleagues from political science, history, Eastern, Slavic, and German studies, to use a phrase from Michel de Montaigne, let them rub their brains against our own brains and help us begin to make sense of what remains senseless. So with thanks to all of you for being here, with thanks to the office of the Dean of the Morrissey College, and with thanks to the departments Political Science, History, and my own home department, Eastern, Slavic, and German Studies, I'll leave the podium to my colleague, Professor Curt Woolhiser, who will lead the conversation this evening. But first, I was asked also to give brief bios of the panelists. Professor Devin Pendas from the History Department is a specialist of German history, European legal history, the history of war and genocide, and the history of war crimes, trials, and human rights. Professor Nicole Eaton, also from the History Department, teaches courses on Soviet history and the Russian Empire. the Second World War, and European history of cities and everyday life. Professor Jerry Easter from Political Science teaches courses in comparative politics with a regional focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. His research interests include the modern state, post-communist transitions, and comparative political economy. Finally, my colleague from Eastern Slavic and German studies and the éminence grise behind this evening's event, Professor Maxim Shrayer. He's a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies, who will hopefully give us tonight a Russian Jew's insights into the war in Ukraine. And the moderator is Professor Curt Woolhiser, who is a sociolinguist who works on Slavic languages, namely Russian and Ukrainian. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Okay. Yeah, I was asked to provide a general introduction to this panel. I don't think it's necessary to sort of rehash everything that has happened over the last year, but still just some sort of highlights, I think, and some things that I think deserve extra emphasis. So on February 24th of this last year, the world awoke in shock and disbelief to the news that Russia had launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Despite the increasingly persistent warnings of the U.S. intelligence community in the weeks and months leading up to this event, few people in the West, myself included, thought that Putin would risk an all-out war. As in the past, in his dealings with Ukraine, he had shown a preference for hybrid tactics, allowing for at least some degree of plausible deniability. The course of the war over the last year has defied the expectations both of the Kremlin and many in the West that the Ukrainian government and the people of Ukraine would soon capitulate, giving Putin a small victorious war to bolster his domestic position, as well as, at least in his mind, to enhance his international standing. Not only the resolve and solidarity of the Ukrainian people and their leaders in response to Russia's war of aggression, but also the generally robust response of the West in supporting Ukraine have changed Moscow's calculations. At this point, it appears that the Russian leadership has accepted the inevitability of a protracted conflict and is now hoping that through its ongoing attacks on both civilian infrastructure and military targets, Russian forces can wear down the Ukrainians and their Western allies, and eventually force the government in Kyiv to enter negotiations that would at the very least lead to recognition of Russia's territorial gains in the east and south, and give Russia veto power over Ukraine's geopolitical orientation. While much of the Western media's attention has been focused on the grueling war of attrition in the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, as well as Russia's relentless attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, the situation in those parts of Ukraine currently under Russian occupation should also receive greater attention. According to reports from eyewitnesses, abduction, torture, and rape of civilians suspected of pro-Ukraine sympathies, often because they simply choose to speak Ukrainian, have become commonplace. The Ukrainian language is being eliminated from schools in these occupied territories, and reports have surfaced of the destruction of Ukrainian books from libraries and schools, and even including things like just Ukrainian literature. Oleksandra Matvichuk, a Ukrainian human rights lawyer and the head of Ukraine's Center for Civil Liberties, has drawn attention to reports that in these occupied territories, Ukrainian children are are being sent to re-education camps, right, to make them patriots of, not of Ukraine, but of Russia. So reviving Tsarist-era narratives regarding Ukraine and the supposed unity of the East Slavic peoples, Putin has repeatedly insisted that Ukraine is historically Russian territory and that there is and cannot be an independent Ukrainian nation. Thus, for Ukrainians, this war is really a struggle, or is not only a struggle for territory, it is also fundamentally a struggle for Ukrainian identity and national self-determination. It appears that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has only strengthened Ukrainian identity, exactly the opposite of what Putin evidently sought to achieve. While in the past, particularly before the Ukrainian Revolution of February 2014, many Ukrainians were quite comfortable with ambiguous and overlapping Ukrainian and Russian identities. Now, after a full year of the Russo-Ukrainian war, there is far less room, sadly, for hybrid identities and practices, and this includes the sphere of language. The trend of urban Russian-speaking Ukrainians switching from Russian to Ukrainian as their preferred language of everyday communication, a topic that I've researched over the last 10 years, has only gained momentum over the last 12 months. So just in conclusion to my introductory remarks, I'd like to add that for me this war has a deeply personal dimension. As I've visited the country, I've done research there several times over the last 2 decades, and have many friends and colleagues throughout the country, even in frontline cities like Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, which is just 25 miles from the Russian border. And I think it bears noting this is really the first European war of the age of social media, and yeah, I must say I still find it rather surreal to read daily Facebook posts from my friends in Kharkiv reporting on the number of Russian missiles that hit the city over the last night, and with a uniquely Ukrainian sort of dark humor. Ukrainians have started referring to these almost routine Russian missile attacks as prilyoti, arrivals or incoming flights. So anyway, on that note, I'd like to turn over the floor now to our panelists. Franck already introduced all of the members of the panel. I'll just indicate what topics they'll be addressing. So Nicole Eaton will be speaking first, and she'll be talking, providing some historical background to the current conflict.
Hello everyone, thanks to Professor Shrayer for organizing, and I am one of the panelists who was not here this last year, and so I'm grateful to be part of the conversation tonight. Let's see. I have one tweak to make, which is to figure out how to show the presenter notes, which is always a question. I think I have to change one feature on the screen here. Do that. Does anyone know how to do that? Here, no? Good. Stop here. Okay, that should do it. Okay, very good. Professor Shrayer asked me to cover the history of Ukraine in 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll have to confess to you that this has been a source of great stress and even a few nightmares over the past month. I had the realization this week that it's an impossible task and would do injustice to the millennium of history of Ukraine. And so instead tonight I'm going to talk about how history is being used in this war, how it's being used and why it matters, why it's really central to our understanding Russia's unjust invasion of Ukraine. And so I first became an historian because I was uninterested in current events and because I wanted to be in the introvert safe space of books where I could sort of indulge in my pedestrian interests. Later, of course, in grad school, later also just being a citizen of the world, I realized that history is contested. It's not just a string of facts, as the great German historian Leopold von Ranke is often misunderstood, having said, wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it really was, as it actually happened. He was more sophisticated than that, but we often say that. We think history is objective. Now, of course, you all growing up in this age, you all who are already grown up, know that history wars happen all the time, that now in the US we are amid one of many history wars about the past of our country, about the founding values of our country, and we know when today people are debating about the role of slavery in the foundation of this country, it's because not only a battle about the past, but about what the present is about, what our values as a society are, and what our future direction as a society should be. And so when I say that history wars are happening in Russia and Ukraine today and are central to this conflict, know that they happen everywhere all the time, but they're especially central to this conflict. And it has been prominent. The role of history, as Putin has used and arguably abused it, I would argue abused it since the very day of the invasion and for decades before, really shows the power of history here. And so I want to talk about the mobilization of history, not in a millennium of Ukraine, but by distilling it into three cases, three myths, as I'm going to call them. And I'm not using the word myth because it's false and not true, not myth as fiction, although we can say we can determine what is fiction and what is useful and perhaps true. But myths, because myths are stories we tell about ourselves as a society, stories that nations tell about themselves, and they help create a sense of identity. So that's why I'm using the term myth here. So let's take on myth number one. And this is a quote by Putin, which Putin made now 1 year ago during his de facto declaration of war against Ukraine. And it Putin stated that modern Ukraine was essentially created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process started practically right after the 1917 revolution, and Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia, by separating and severing what is historically Russian land. That's a phrase that Professor Woolhiser used and I'll return to. He developed this idea by stating that Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy and can be rightfully called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and architect. Okay, so let's unpack that. The social media response was vivid and it was comedic among Ukrainians especially. And here's just one montage. This is a famous statue of Kiev. So one montage in particular inserted Lenin, you can see here up at the head, among a monument to the legendary founders of Kiev, the brothers Kilishek and Kurov and their sister Libet. And Lenin replaced Libet at the prow of the boat carrying the founders to the Ukrainian capital. And so this monument tells us a lot of things. One, it expresses Ukrainians' sense that their country's roots goes back to the Middle Ages, not to 1917. So the absurdity of this is here on full display. Okay, but what about the foundations of the modern state of Ukraine? That's what Putin was talking about. Did Lenin indeed create it? What would that even mean, right? So it's true, again, not a millennium of history here, but one map. It is true, which I stole from the internet, like everything you'll see here. The polity of Kievan Rus from the medieval period was somewhere around here and grew somewhere in that direction, right? Later, as its influence, Kievan meaning from Kiev, as its influence waned, the influence of Moscow, the Principality of Moscow, grew. Once sort of underneath Kievan Rus grew, and as Moscow became the Russian Empire, it grew outward and absorbed, or arguably reabsorbed, the lands of Ukraine. Some of what we now call the lands of Ukraine. And so the Russian Empire saw itself as Rus's natural inheritor, the point here being both Ukraine and and Russia, what became the Russian Empire, see that the center of their civilization was here. They both claim it as part of their national identity. Ukraine state, this is not, first of all, this is not an entirely accurate map, and I'll explain a little why. Ukraine state borders today are the result of a much redrawing over the course of many centuries. The territory that is now Ukraine was once divided between many of the empires of Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, even in the case of Crimea, the Crimean Khanate was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. And so this map is a bit misleading because all maps are a bit misleading, and all maps are sort of a product of the ideas of the map maker. And in this case, it makes it look like Ukraine used to be just this, and that that's the real Ukraine, and the rest is just addition. So I want to point out that that is not at all my intention, but the color coding is very helpful for us, because it shows that Ukraine's borders grew in many directions and for many reasons. Much of it, what we now call Ukraine, did indeed become part of this polity during the Soviet period. As you can see here, the territory that Vladimir Lenin put in mostly more. This is Stalin's expansions, which moved the borders of Poland during the Second World War. And Nikita Khrushchev transferred the administrative unit of Crimea from the Russian Socialist Republic to Ukraine. But Lenin did not create modern Ukraine. He was not its architect. The region existed. Many romantic nationalists, though not necessarily the majority of the population, envisioned already a separate Ukraine and a Ukrainian identity in the 19th century, during the era of national awakenings. During the revolution in the 20th century and during the Russian Civil War, or we might call it the Bolshevik Civil War because it was multi-ethnic and not only involving Russians, Ukrainian revolutionaries even attempted to create an independent socialist republic of their own. Bolshevik forces invaded it in 1918, massacred hundreds, if not thousands, of the inhabitants of Kiev and installed Bolshevik power. They did this across the Soviet space. Lenin realized that Ukrainian independence movements were so strong that the Bolsheviks needed to grant Ukraine autonomous status within the Soviet Republic, within the new Soviet state, that is, in order to appease the secessionists, in order to create the stability. And so the Soviet Union, as a concession, granted Ukraine republic status in 1922. So why is this idea of Lenin creating Ukraine so important? Putin uses it to delegitimate Ukrainian state sovereignty. If the Bolsheviks, based in Moscow, created the Ukrainian state, then Russia has the right, according to this argument, to revoke that statehood, that it was a gift. It used similar arguments in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. This idea quickly becomes nonsensical when you think about the global repercussions of such a principle. But it's important to understand how Russian national identity still understands Russia as the metropole of a sphere of influence. And that sphere consists of lands that were once part of the Russian Empire, especially if Slavic language speakers live there. This brings us to our next myth, the idea that Russia is not engaging in a foreign war, but is only merely reclaiming, quote, historic Russian lands. Putin used this phrase during his initial invasion, and pundits and propagandists have repeated it over and over this past year. Putin leaned on it very heavily during his speeches this week leading up to the one-year anniversary of the start of the war. We can understand the rationale now after looking at myth one. That's pretty easy, right? The idea that these lands were artificially granted to Ukraine and constitute therefore a historical injustice. But I want to highlight some of the deeper underlying assumptions here. First, this idea of historic lands has a self-justifying appeal. Many nationalist arguments over the course of the past century have leaned on this idea of the need to claim ancestral lands. This is especially true in contested territories in multi-ethnic regions, including much of East Central Europe after the fall of multi-ethnic empires. It's also the case with Israel-Palestine and with much of the world over. In Russia's case, it also shows how Putin is drawing on the legacy, again, of the Russian Empire in an attempt to reassert Russia's role and rights on the world stage. This principle of historic lands, ancestral homelands, reclaiming ancestral territory, is ultimately always self-defeating because one can always find, or contradictory, let's say, one can always find an older population who lived there. You can take it back to absurdity, right? You know, someone, okay, well, who lived there but 10 years before that? 10 years before that. Next thing you know, you've gone back to the continent of Pangaea and there are only dinosaurs, right? And to determine what these people thought about themselves and which nation they were part of becomes increasingly a fruitless task. So ultimately, what only matters is the present day. And at the risk of oversimplifying it, there are still two competing contradictory principles that are nearly impossible to reconcile, but which people have been grappling, especially Europeans have been grappling with, but not only, for over a century now. Which is first, what are the wishes of the local population in question? That would be national self-determination. Woodrow Wilson really loved this idea of the First World War and the breakup of empires, that people would basically decide who they were and they would get a state, right? But second, do we respect state sovereignty as first and foremost an important principle in international relations, right? Russia wants state sovereignty to reign supreme when dealing with separatist movements within its own territories, such as in the Caucasus, but it wants national self-determination to reign supreme when it comes to the Russian-speaking population of Eastern Ukraine. So the problem is, of course, that national self-determination and political loyalties cut across the lines of language, religion, and even ethnicity. As Professor Woolhiser mentioned, there are many hybrid identities, many languages spoken on any given day. Asking someone who they were and what they were might change, and they've changed over time. If you take, for example, the two regions currently occupied by Russia, Crimea since 2014, the Donbass and hybrid war, and then now since 2021, in plebiscites, nearly 100% of people voted for Russia. We know this is, of course, false. These plebiscites were under duress, that they can't actually be representative of the population. But on the ground reports today in territories still occupied by Russia or recently liberated, it's complex. Now, most of the people who were pro-Ukraine might have fled before the occupation, but some reports in Zoom, and Joshua Yaffa was recently reporting in the New Yorker, 50-50. Local people speculated that the loyalties were 50-50. This is really a mess, and even those who were pro-Russian, many of them have changed their minds after seeing the brutality and calamity of the Russian occupation, and some vice versa. I mention that because it's messy, not because I wanted to delegitimate the Ukrainian attempt to capture this territory and to in any way delegitimate this authentically part of the Ukrainian state. But the loyalties of the population, the identity of the population is not possible to determine in a simple way. So, and in what cases then should international powers recognize such a land transfer, even if there was such a legitimate plebiscite? When would it represent the majority of the population's wishes, however determined? So, let's tackle this third myth. This is very powerful in Russia, and it's also very powerful in the European and American alternative media on both the left and the right. It's something that many of you who read about this conflict and care about it have come across. Many of my students and former students and colleagues have asked me, what about the Nazis in Ukraine? Well, this is the claim that Putin and other Russian propagandists have been making, arguably since the Orange Revolution, that is, since Ukraine's first attempt to turn away from Russian post-Soviet domestic influence in the early 2000s, and increasingly in the past decade. It's this idea that Ukraine is a Nazi regime that commits repressive ethnic cleansing actions against Russia, Ukraine's Russian-speaking population, and that Russia's mission in its so-called special operation, our war, is, as Putin insists, to denazify Ukraine. This is a tough one. I'll do my best to keep it brief, and this is my last point. Putin and these propagandists are drawing on 2 points in history. One from the Second World War, and one from the more recent period. And so let's unpack them. First is the claim that the Ukrainian state is somehow Nazi or fascist. The first one has to do with the legacies of Ukrainian nationalism during the Second World War. Most inhabitants of the Soviet Union suffered greatly during Stalin's rule. Arguably, among the people who suffered the most were the people living in Ukraine. And I call them people living in Ukraine, not Ukrainians, because they were Russian speakers, they were Polish speakers, they were Yiddish speakers, there were Ukrainian speakers, there were other Tatar language speakers. There were many, many peoples in Ukraine. Most infamous now is the Holodomor, is what is often referred to as a genocide of the Ukrainian people during Stalin's brutal collectivization drives. It is absolutely true that 5 million people, arguably more, died in Ukraine. People also died in other parts of the Soviet Union. So I don't want to go into the complexities of that now. Ukraine suffered greatly. The people of Ukraine suffered greatly in the 1930s. When the Nazis and the German army occupied Ukraine during the Second World War, many partisan movements operated on Ukrainian soil to start to form an independent Ukrainian state. They obviously worked together with the Nazis, who were the occupiers. In order to do that, they saw the Nazis as the lesser evil and the Soviets, whom they'd experienced for the last decades, as the greater evil. One of the most famous of these is Stepan Bandera, who was a famous Ukrainian nationalist and is deeply celebrated today as one of the great patriots and promoters of the modern Ukrainian nation, a modern Ukrainian statehood, rather. But this is a complex legacy. These nationalist units took part in the Holocaust. They took part in ethnic cleansings against Poles and other non-Ukrainian peoples. And today's independent Ukraine, this legacy is very difficult for to grapple with. They haven't done this sort of reworking of the past to grapple with this, and it's very controversial. Here's a news headline. This is from just early 2023. Poland condemns Ukraine's commemoration of wartime nationalist leader Bandera. And I point this out because Poland has a similar problem. Polish groups also were active in killing Jews and participating in the Holocaust and working with the Nazis. They also suffered greatly under the Nazis. But there are two countries, not just one, many countries, where the dilemmas of occupation also coincided with rampant anti-Semitism and ethnic cleansing that wasn't just done under Nazi command. So I mentioned this complex legacy because it happened. But reducing Bandera either to only a Ukrainian patriot or only a genocide committer reduces his, sort of oversimplifies his legacy. I certainly would not wear his T-shirt. I personally would not use him as the founder of the Ukrainian nation. So that's there. But does that mean that Ukraine today is a Nazi state? No, that does not. So let's move to the present day. Ukraine, like much of the post-Soviet space and post-Eastern Bloc, like most of East Central Europe, has experienced the resurgence of populist, quasi-fascist, right-wing parties after the fall of communism. Ukrainian far right was a very popular object of study in the 2000s, but its influence actually diminished in the past decade or so, and it's not very central to Ukrainian politics. In 2014, during the Russian sort of proxy war and invasion and Crimean annexation, the now famous or infamous Azov Battalion was formed as a unit to defend Ukraine. And this group does belong to the far right. They use Nazi runes and various symbols. They're racist. They're not good kids. They're not about it. Sorry. They're not good kids. But it's more complex than that. The group has grown and changed over time from a small battalion to a division to, I don't know, military terms. And many, many more people are a part of it. Do all of the members represent this ideology? No. Does that ideology still exist? Is it still prominent? Are they still very much nationalist and exclusionary, racist, fascist? Yeah, maybe some of them are, absolutely. But still, this is also the case in Russia. This is also the case in Russia. There are far-right fascist youth group movements. There are proud Nazis in Russia, right? Does that mean that Russia is there to denazify Ukraine? No. I hope I'm showing the complexity of this, because I think what I see in the news media often is that there are no Nazis in Ukraine. This is a total fabrication. Like, there are Nazis in the U.S. too. Is the U.S. a Nazi state? That's where the complexity is. If the U.S. was invaded and the Proud Boys formed a militia, and that militia grew to like 20,000 people, that's what we're dealing with. So Russia is not actually on a mission to denazify Ukraine. The real reason that Putin and Russian propagandists use this language is because it resonates strongly with the Russian public. And it does so because it is utterly fundamental to Russian national identity and Russia's sense of its mission today. So what's that about? And this is my final point. The Soviet Union was founded on the mission of a world communist revolution. World War II changed that mission in that World War II became the foundational moment of the regime and gave it a new lease on life until 1991. That was not just for the Russian part of the Soviet Union, all of the Soviet Union. It became the main legitimating myth, the victory over the Nazis in World War II. So check out, and that worked until the Soviet collapse. And so check out this famous photo. I know many, if not all of you, have seen this. This is by the photographer Yevgeny Khalday. He was a Soviet Red Navy officer. I want to say Red Army Navy. That's anyway. But he's also Jewish. And he was born in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. And so this most famous representative of Soviet nationhood and the mission to denazify was a Ukrainian Jew. A Russian-speaking Ukrainian Jew, I should say. Today, Ukraine no longer celebrates this legacy, the legacy of the defeat over fascism, right? Because their legacy is the struggle against Soviet tyranny, right? And so they cannot, in the state founding myth, adopt both equally. But this is also part of Ukraine's history, or the people of Ukraine's history, right? But because the Ukrainian state failed to achieve its independence, the temptation there is to see the Soviets as the greater evil than the Nazis, right, in the national myth formation. But in Russia, it has continued and continues to be part of the Soviet, post-Soviet Russian national identity. The idea that Russia inherited this legacy, that was all of the Soviet Union's legacy, that it is a humane actor on the world stage, that it fights fascism everywhere it goes, and that, to quote Putin, Russia doesn't start wars, it ends them. Right? Which sounds absurd, right, when you think about this war. But that's where it is. So there are many more examples. I'll talk about more if we have time in the Q&A, but I want to conclude by asking, why does history matter so much here? Because, as I mentioned, the stories we tell about our history are the stories that tell us who we are as a society. In Ukraine and in Russia today, the telling and retelling of this contested history is more important than ever. Both societies claim the same ancient inheritances, but they imagine different presents and different futures from them. In Ukraine, history is used to emphasize the long existence of the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian state traditions, and Ukrainian nationhood. In Russia, that history is used to emphasize Russia's imperial rule over Ukraine, and by extension, its right to grant or deny these identities vis-a-vis the population of today's Ukraine. And it's also used in Russia to help form a new foundation for Russia's national identity, which now, after the loss of colonies or loss of the Soviet space, is ever more important in Russia today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we'll wait for questions and discussion until all the panelists have spoken. Our next panelist is my colleague Maxim Shrayer, who will be talking about Ukraine as a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country, and also the role of religious leaders and also various minorities in the current conflict.
Thank you so much, and good evening. I will just take a minute to hook the monster up, and once we have the slides up, I will proceed. And I just want to say that I think most of us, if not all of us, pray fervently for Ukraine's victory, and this is a mournful anniversary. This is not a happy occasion, but it also is an opportunity to reflect both on the history of the conflict, and Professor Eaton has just done so beautifully and in a very nuanced way, but also to think of what this war is changing in Ukraine's, the texture of Ukraine's everyday life. It's a very large country with almost 50 million, one of the largest by population, and it's a complex country. And I stand before you really, in a sense, less as a professor or a cultural historian, and more as a Jewish immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and as is the case with a plurality, perhaps a majority of Jews from the former Soviet Union, I have my roots in the lands that are within the present internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. And again, as Professor Eaton already explained, these lands over the past centuries have been within different polities and countries, and this is particularly important for the history of Ukraine's ethno-religious minorities, right? Kiev and Rus, the Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Muscovy, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire in the southwest, but also, of course, the Soviet Union. And I have a very personal connection to this conflict because 3 of my grandparents were born and grew up in Ukrainian lands. And I just want to give you a little bit of a personal history. So on 2 sides, both of my maternal grandfathers of blessed memory were born and grew up in Kamyanets-Podilsk, or Kamyanets-Podilsky, which was a provincial capital, a very important city in the southwest of Ukraine. And just to give you some sense of the ethnic and religious makeup of what Ukraine is and used to be, in 1923, half of the population of this city was Jewish. And so this boy, the taller of the 2 boys in the front row, is my late grandfather Pesach, with his family, with his siblings that lived past infanthood into adulthood. And and by the way, this is the mother of my late maternal grandfather. So, of course, a lot of what remains in Ukraine are matzevos, the Jewish gravestones, not the people themselves. And this is a bit on the merrier note. So the kid who is in that funny hat with a little arrow, who is in this group of Jewish scouts in 1923, is my late grandfather's older brother, who was an agrarian socialist and who later made Aliyah and went to the British Mandate of Palestine. And then this house used to be our house. It's still there on Saborna Cathedral Street in Kamenets, and then it became the office of the regional attorney general. And actually, people knew it as the Shrayer house, which was then, the house where, various local crimes were investigated. And also on a different side, so this is the town of Paradok, which used to be, it's kind of halfway between Vinnytsia and Kamenets, so this is kind of again, southwestern Ukraine, and it's a kind of smallish town. The very pretty girl with blonde hair in the back is my late grandmother, who came here with us and lived till 95. And next with her brother, that's her father, and cousins. This is 1931. This family was destroyed first by Stalinist purges, then by the Shoah, and by the time I was born, we had no living relatives in Ukraine because either they had been killed or in the 1950s, the climate was quite anti-Semitic, and many Jews who survived actually left Ukraine, and that's something that modern Ukraine grapples with, no matter how you slice it. So that's a little bit of the personal connection. But I want to talk a bit about the legacy of Ukraine's minorities. This is a particularly telling data, and this is the 1897 Imperial Census. So basically, look, 73% of Ukrainian lands are Ukrainian-speaking. So this flies directly in the face of Putin's myths. But also, look, Russian is in second place, but look what's in third place, almost 2 million Yiddish speakers. Just pause for a minute and reflect on that. Third, followed by very formidable German, Polish, and also very sizable Romanian minority, right? So let's talk a little bit about how this is playing out today. So you have this map of the ethno-linguistic Ukraine, and the colors tell their own story, and also the absence of colors. As you can see, this chart tells you, and again, just remember what we just saw there, and then this chart tells you about the present proportions, right? Ukrainians are almost 80%, followed by less than 20% Russians. But look at the other present minorities. They are very small numbers. And that's an important point to make. Ukraine is a very multi-ethnic and multilingual country still today. But, of course, the minorities are nowhere near the numbers that they used to enjoy 50, 70, 100 years, and of course 200, 300, etc. also specifically to focus on the world of Christianity again. So this represents the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is increasingly now, and Professor Woolhiser knows so much more about it than I do, falling under the umbrella of the Kiev Patriarchate rather than the Moscow Patriarchate. But of course, Ukraine's complexity is it also has the Uniate Church in the West. So this is Byzantine Rite Catholics, and it also has, so to say, true Catholics, Latin Rite Catholics, Polish Catholics. And so that's just the Christian world. On top of that, this is a nice way of contrasting the numbers based on ethnic group. And again, Ukrainians, Russians, Romanians, Belarusians, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians. Ukrainians love to pride themselves on how diverse they are. And it's true. To the right are religious numbers. And I find this particularly revealing, right? Because it tells you Orthodox Christianity, different umbrellas, Catholics, both Roman Catholic, Latin Church, and Uniates, but also, this is my addition, it wasn't even in the Wikimedia chart, 0.3% the Jewish minority and 0.9% the Muslim minority. Again, guys, these are small numbers. They are not insignificant, but they are very small. Which brings me to two questions. And here, I suppose, this is a little challenge. Well, Professor Eaton got the challenge. Certain things I might do the same. So some time ago, I did a piece for Tablet, which was about sort of the boycotts of everything Russian, and I interviewed various players, including this very, 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 very elegantly spoken former Deputy Ukrainian Minister of Culture, Paradok, who wrote a piece which was quoted a lot, called "Good Russians Do Not Exist." So I posed a question to her. I said, when you say good Russians do not exist, they have not been born yet. Do you think this statement could be conceived as hateful or perhaps intolerant toward some 8 million ethnic Russian citizens of Ukraine, a majority of whom are Ukrainian patriots now fighting in Ukraine's army and regional defense against the invasion of Russia's armed forces? And this is what she replied. She wrote in English, so I didn't translate this. For me, Russians in this context are Russian citizens, holders of Russian passports, who elected Putin in all elections, who adopt and accept his domestic and foreign policies, who do not fight for their rights or for human rights in general. And here comes the most interesting part. Professor Woolhiser and I go back to the time when we were both in graduate school. And back then, in the summer of '90, we both taught at Indiana in the Language Institute. And I remember he was going to Belarus to document the disappearance of Belarusian in urban areas. And I thought it was the coolest project. But basically, why I bring this up, what she says here, and I do not mention in any way in the text Ukrainians who, for one reason or another, speak Russian. I know the reasons, and there is an understanding that this will change in 5 to 10 years, calmly and without pressure. So as I read this, what she's saying is that basically this will have become a place where the Russian speakers will have been replaced by Ukrainian speakers to some degree. And it interests me as a student of minorities and a student of languages and minority languages. That's one. And lastly, I want to talk finally about the question of religious minorities and their views of the war. It's a remarkable story because from the very start of the Russian invasion, and I've looked a lot at the religious leaders of the Jewish community, of the Protestant community, Catholic community, and of course Orthodox community. You have this sentiment where religious leaders in Ukraine are coming behind the war and speaking about the war not only as a patriotic war, which by the way echoes the Soviet wartime rhetoric of the war against Nazism, fascism as a patriotic just war, but also as a religiously justified war. This is a very famous speech by a Hasidic rabbi in the Brodsky Synagogue in Kiev. I'll quote it. "I'm the rabbi of Ukraine. I'm proud that I have the honor of saving people. I'm on the side of light and not on the side of those who do the killing. Remember that he who is indifferent and he who silently agrees is a co-participant in the crime, war crime, or crime against humanity. And he uses a Russian word, soучастник, which could be translated as accomplice or accessory, so it has a broad spectrum of meanings. And then he speaks literally as a religious leader, and he says, and if God forbid I am to perish, let a curse be on those who are silent and silently co-participate in this terrible crime. I stand here with the Holy Torah. So basically, he's getting behind the war of Ukrainian liberation, the war against Russia, as a Ukrainian patriot and as a religious leader. And so, in some sense, of course, guys, when I look at images of religious Jews in Ukrainian uniform, my heart is filled with pride. How else could it be? But there is a flip side to this. And this is kind of the last point that I want to address very quickly. The latest data is that over 15,000 Ukrainians made Aliyah, left Ukraine for Israel. This is an astoundingly high number. So how do you reconcile this? Right? Jews, as not just Ukrainian patriots, but fighting in the Ukrainian military forces, and members of small ethno-religious communities who also flee. This begs the question of the future of Ukraine's small minorities. And I'm not saying I'm worried. The point here is not to worry. Of course, the point here is to wish Ukraine the speediest possible victory. But it also is to think that, in a sense, and this brings me to truly my last observation, this is not just a war of Ukraine's patriotic liberation against Putin's Russia and the Russian invasion. It is also a war, I would suggest, in which spirits of the Soviet and specifically the Stalinist nationalities policy are continuing to fight their final battles. This image that was in the poster and that you see today, I took this picture the last time I was in Kiev. This is the famous Stlinist Empire style building at Kreshchatyk 25. So there are many of those buildings in Moscow. They're part of this grand Stalinist vision that he never got to see because he, thank God, died in 1953, but the building was erected. So basically, it's a very Soviet Stalinist building. I like this image because these are lights, but they kind of look like barbed wire. And so I leave you with the question of how the legacy of Soviet and Stalinist policy on nationalities and on national and concomitantly religious minorities is playing itself out in the war and will continue to play itself out in the new victorious Ukraine. Thank you.
I'll just introduce our next panelist. So now we will get a perspective from political science by Gerald Easter, who will be talking about the implications of this war in Europe and around the world.
Hi, thank you. For this talk, I was asked to put the conflict in a geopolitical perspective, so that's what I plan to do. But I was here, it was mentioned that by Franck, Professor Salameh, that I was here last year. And I remember very well at the time that we were lamenting that the death toll is creeping up towards 10,000. But there was a sense of an optimism, a hopefulness, I guess, better said, that there was talk of peace. And there were some peace negotiations in March of last year that came to naught. And so here we are a year later. The war now, the numbers in terms of casualties and fatalities are in the hundreds of thousands. Ukraine has lost a fifth of its territory as of now. a fifth of its population, over 8 million refugees, in addition to the battlefield deaths. The people that are losing are disproportionately women, and one wonders if this war, if we're here in another year, how difficult it and how long-term it will be for a coherent, substantive Ukraine nation to exist again in this territory, on these lands. It's depressing that at this moment the talk is all about escalation, not about peace from the principles. So, for my talk, what I wanted to do was to talk about the geopolitical perspective, is to put explain the war in its multi-dimensions, and then try to connect each of the dimensions to prospects for peace in Ukraine. So the causes of the war that are debated, that we mostly hear, first we hear that Putin is to blame, that Putin is a leader either for ego reasons or the need for political support that was mentioned at home, or for being an agent of an imperial aggrandizement, is the cause, and if it was not for Putin, we would not have the war. That argument, which was more common a year ago, is less so now, and now we hear more so that it's not Putin, but rather it's Russia. That it's something about Russia that Putin is simply a manifestation of, that Russia has never been able to accept the loss of its empire, that there's a mentality in regard that Russians have in regard to those who used to be part of its empire, one in which they assume that they should still play a role that is on top, and also connected to that would be Russia's long history, that it tells itself the way it was, how across the centuries it has been overrun across the flat land borders, and it's, I think, the case as well, not just an imperialist notion in the head, but it's been the case for Russia geopolitically that it seeks security by expanding outward and defining buffer zones between itself and those whom deemed to be hostile to it, like Mongol Turkic horse riders, like Poles, like Germans, like the French, who at one time or another came to visit Moscow. And that Russia defines its own security, and because of this kind of geostrategic situation, it defines its own security directly in relation to its immediate neighbors' insecurity. So that's another argument that gets put forward to explain Russia. It's Russia, it's not Putin or just Putin. And then the third one that's most common is that the war is the result of an aggressive NATO expansion, and of US policy, which has sought to keep post-communist Russia in a position in which it cannot be a competitor to the US in various military, economic influence around the globe as a great power actor. And those are the main debates. I would add a fourth that never gets mentioned. I don't think post-communist Ukrainians elites have served their nation very well. Before any of this began, Ukraine, with all of its potential for wealth, was the poorest country in Europe. And Russia is not to blame for that. Ukraine's own elites are to blame for that. So I would just add that Ukrainian politics and what was 2 decades of dysfunction in its attempts to become a post-communist democracy contributed as well to the events that have subsequently lead to the war. So, but in terms of those different causes, I would say that that's the debate, and it gets fought bitterly. And I would stress to you that it's a false debate, because all of these factors are culprits in what is happening in Ukraine today. It is a confluence of factors which have brought us to this point. Not one only. So to think of the war in a multi-dimensional way, I would point to 3 different features of what goes on in the conflict in Ukraine. The first one is internal to Ukraine. This is a war over the identity of the nation. It is it was assumed in political science among my Ukrainian friends that I went to grad school with in the 80s and into the 90s, that Ukraine was a divided nation. This isn't outsiders. This was people like Alexander Motyl, who is, some of you might know, who's a Ukrainian intellectual political scientist. And that at least one factor in this conflict is this ethno-regional divide between the West, the Galician West, and the Far East has been politicized and mobilized. It was not the case, I believe, up until I think only recently, that these maybe competing, national identities were at odds with one another. They coexisted quite nicely, maybe peaceably in Ukraine for quite a while. And it's the events in the 2014 Maidan, in which the president, he's a corrupt autocrat, who was elected in what was recognized as a legitimate and fair election by a host of your EU observers, but that he also represented the ethno-Russian East, and that when he was overthrown for several reasons, from being an corrupt autocrat, and also for making the choice that post-communist Ukraine should lean towards Russia, not towards the EU, which was a choice that was imposed on him by the EU because the cost that the EU put on Ukraine to become a member of the EU were quite steep. And Putin opened up his pocketbook to offer a better deal. But anyways, those events led to a rejection of the outcome of the Maidan Revolution in at least some places in the East. And the response of the Ukrainian army to that, to those counter-protests, I suppose, was the opportunity when the Russian military intervened and turned it into a frozen conflict. But what happened a year ago was a war didn't begin. A year ago, Russia intervened into a war. Between 2014 and 2021, there's 50,000 casualties, 14,000 deaths, 3,000 civilian deaths along what became the demarcation between the Russia-backed separatist East and the western portions of Lugansk and Donetsk. But that's one dimension of the war. And it was pointed out that on the Russian side, there's been ethnic cultural cleansing, and indeed there has, but that cuts both ways too. The mayor of Kharkiv, I read this week, for the second time was fined for doing a Facebook or Twitter post in the Russian language. Also this week I read that there's a committee that was very proud to announce that the 10th million volume had been purged from the shelves of the library. A Russian language book had been purged from the shelves of Ukrainian libraries. So it's cutting both ways, and the concern expressed at the end of Professor Shrayer's talk about what will come out of this, I think is real, because will there be a place left for a multi-ethnic Ukraine, or a hybrid identity Ukraine? And war is one of the great accelerators of identity, not formation so much, but of crystallizing. In particular, we all have multiple identities within us, but some become crystallized and salient. And war is one of the things that can do that. And you see that happening now. And so there is this internal conflict, which is part of the conflict going on. The second is that Russia wants to define for itself a sphere of influence in what used to be the peripheral regions where non-Russian peoples live. They've sought this and have succeeded in Belarus in doing so. In the Caucasus, it's a bit more complicated, but they have influence there, particularly in Armenia, in Kazakhstan as well, and a sliver of Moldova as well. And the empire is over, I think, but nonetheless, they want to assert a right to be able to veto certain political regimes that they deem explicitly hostile to them, political regimes that welcome their foreign enemies to bring forward their weapon systems. They would like to exercise that role in the region. They're trying to bully their way into being a regional hegemon, not unlike what the U.S. does in its part of the world. So that's another dimension to the war. The third one is the role of the Ukraine war is also a proxy war. and the role of the U.S. in particular, but U.S. and NATO, and a few other countries, are an important part of the conflict. And at this point, 1 year out, I would contend that this dimension of the war is ascendant. And whether or not there is peace will ultimately be on what's either won or lost or compromised on this level, in this dimension. It's not the case that Russia invaded Ukraine and the U.S. said, "Egads, there are bullies afoot. Let us rush to their rescue after, visit the nearby phone booth and then fly to their rescue because that's what we do." That's not how the U.S. ended up in this conflict. The U.S. was in this conflict before 2022. There was I'm on the spot deciding whether to drop something or not, but I'll keep it. There is, in 2019, the RAND Corporation. RAND is an acronym. It means Research and Development. It's a big, well-financed think tank out in Santa Monica on the coast there. And they essentially have one client. Their client is the U.S. military and the U.S. security establishment. And in 2019, RAND did I think it's close to 200-page study called Extending Russia. What can we do it identifies Russia, I'm from around here. It identifies Russia. Every time I hear that, I go, what am I doing in this classroom? But it identifies Russia as a quote-unquote a peer competitor in a series of critical areas. And we don't like that about Russia, so what can we do about it? And the bottom line, among the recommendations, is let's see what we can do with Ukraine, which is identified in this RAND report as the external point of greatest vulnerability for Russia. And the recommendations are, let's send lethal aid, let's do things like drop out of the INF treaty, and then either threaten to, and maybe we will, send some intermediate range missiles into Ukraine, which can arrive at the Kremlin in 5 minutes or less. It argues that let's forward base our bombers so that they can have access to strategic targets within Russia. It says, so we want to weaken Russia militarily. It's very explicit about this. We also want to weaken them economically. And the first thing on the list is Russia is vulnerable because it's so dependent on the income it makes from its energy exports. So let's do something about that. Try to depress world oil prices, but also what's identified is let's try to drive a wedge between Russia and its European customers. Let's buy Russian gas. There's recent revelations about the Nord Stream explosion in recent weeks, which give us more circumstantial evidence that the U.S. is likely the actor that carried that out. Anyways, they had the motives, they had the means, and they had the intentive, they stated the intent explicitly. So, but to weaken Russia economically in these types of ways, to isolate Russia in the world. You can isolate them in the world by more sanctions. You can isolate them with disinformation. This is all in the report. This is from and the fourth thing, and I think the main thing, is that create the conditions for regime change in Russia, to promote domestic protests, and to try to remove Putin from power, who's the bane of the central actors in the Biden administration who are responsible for the Ukraine war, which is Sullivan, the security person, Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, Biden himself, and the Secretary of State, Blinken. But there is this program, and when the idea is, it also says explicitly that if we provoke Russia too much, they might actually intervene. And that would be too bad, because there'd be a lot of casualties and Ukraine would probably lose territory. But that's a risk that might be worth taking. The upside outweighs the downside. A subsequent RAND report from just the last few months continues to say that, well, things didn't go exactly as planned with this policy package, but nonetheless, at the expense of Ukraine, we could keep it going. This proxy war is by all means part of what's going on as well. And as, I guess I would just to say that, it's a year later. If you look at all three actors, they all are very dug into intractable positions. Ukraine can't negotiate until every inch of territory has been recovered. Russia can't negotiate until they get the security deal from the West that they want. Last year we were talking about maybe a good thing for Ukraine was to kind of become like Finland, remember? Well, Finland, spent several decades being neutral and becoming prosperous and getting itself away from Russia. So that's a success, and maybe eventually, into NATO. But at this point, maybe Koreanization is the more likely outcome. On the Russian side, they're just going to stand there and pound. They're doing attrition and artillery. They learned it from Napoleon. They learned it well. That's how they beat the Nazis. And they're gonna keep doing it. And they just have more weapons and they have more people. Ukraine's hope is to expand the war into a wider conflict and bring in other nations. And maybe a year from now, the war will be over. I kind of doubt it. Maybe a year from now, instead, we'll be talking about a regional war in which not NATO, but some Poland, maybe a few US actors, maybe Romanians are fighting the Russians and the Belarusians. Or, the next escalation is World War III. And the next escalation after that is nuclear weapons. Part of the RAND report was tactical nuclear weapons, which is short-range field battle weapons, also could be put in Ukraine. So, the Russians read that. They said, let's take advantage of Russians' anxiety about their borders. And so, that's part of the war too. This war won't end until the proxy war is done.
Our last panelist is Devin Pendas from the Department of History, and he'll be talking about war crimes and post-war justice.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks for coming out on such a lovely evening. I have a somewhat different perspective on things. I'm going to talk, though, primarily about the legal dimensions of the Russian war in Ukraine. And the first point that I want to make is that the war is comprehensively criminal in every possible respect, right? By any reasonable reading of international law, both in terms of commitments that Russia has explicitly undertaken, like the United Nations Charter, in terms also of customary international law as that exists, and then obviously some kind, and things like the Geneva Conventions, which Russia is a party to, some things like the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, which Russia is not a state party to, but which Ukraine has granted jurisdiction over the conflict, right? So there's a whole slew of rules that have been developed, you know, in some ways going back to the 19th century, but really taking off after World War II, that govern two things in particular, right? First, when you can fight a war legally, right? What are the conditions under which you're allowed to engage in military action? And then second, what kinds of violence you're permitted to use during wartime, right? Who you can kill legally, right, and who you can't. And on all of those dimensions, Russia is in clear violation of multiple international laws, right? So let's start with the invasion itself. Right. Under the United Nations Charter, you are allowed to resort to military action for two reasons. Right? One is an act of self-defense. Right? The threat has to be clear and present. Right? The second is with United Nations authorization, primarily through the Security Council, which obviously does not, obtain here. Now, you might maybe make an argument that Russia is acting in some kind of self-defense against some sort of nefarious, undeclared American proxy war. I think you would have to have a lot more than a RAND report to make that case. But in any event, it seems that the threat that Ukraine might have posed to Russia is anything but clear and immediate. Right? So the invasion itself, at the very beginning of the war, is already a criminal act. Right? Now, the second dimension that's criminal here is the annexation of Ukrainian territory. Right? One of the basic rules of international law, right, is that you are not allowed to conquer territory from sovereign states and take it over and incorporate it into your territory. Right? That's just flat out illegal. Right? And so, yes, there are provisions for referenda to allow for transfer of territory, right? Anybody who thinks that any referendum in which 99% of the population votes in favor of anything, right? That's so clearly not a legitimate election, not a legitimate referendum. You couldn't get 99% of people to vote in favor of puppies. Right, so that's clearly a sham, right? And so the annexation of Ukrainian territory is itself fundamentally illegal under international law, right? Third, right, the way that Russia is waging war at a strategic level is also illegal, right? Particularly this past winter, they have engaged in the systematic bombardment of civilian infrastructure, civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, churches, right? All of that is illegal under international law. You might be able to make a case that some kinds of dual-use infrastructure, railroads, and this sort of thing are legitimate military targets. Maybe you could make that case for the electric grid. I think that one would be hard to litigate. But certainly, the bombardment of hospitals is, clearly illegal, right? Then there's the question of war crimes in the more strict sense, right? There's abundant evidence from eyewitnesses and forensic evidence now in liberated areas of Ukraine that Russia has engaged in widespread torture, murder, rape, right? So it's less clear from at least public source data how much that's a matter of official policy versus how much that's something that is happening kind of on a bottom-up basis. It does seem to be remarkably widespread in occupied territories, which suggests at least some level of tolerance on the part of the military hierarchy, if not making it a natural policy, which would mean that high-ranking military officers would be criminally liable under the doctrine of command responsibility, even if it's not formal policy, right? There is a case to be made that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, right? One of the categories that constitutes genocide under the United Nations Genocide Convention is forcibly transferring children from one community to another, right? We know that around 14,000 Ukrainian children have been deported from Ukraine to Russia, where they are being, outsourced to Russian families, right? Being denationalized, if you will, and under a kind of a surface reading of the Genocide Convention, that's an act of genocide, right? It's not the one most people typically think of, but it's pretty much right there in the statute, right? And so, I would suggest that literally every aspect of Russia's war in Ukraine is criminal, right? And that's something that needs to be calculated when thinking about what peace might look like, right? The occupied territories of Ukraine are not someplace you want to be right now, right? There's a lot of violence, and if there is a peace in which major portions of Ukraine remain occupied by Russia, it seems reasonable to think that these kinds of policies of violence, murder, torture, forced assimilation, denationalization would likely continue, right? And so any peace deal that gets made, if it ends up ceding territory to Russia from Ukraine, you just have to be clear-eyed about what that means for the Ukrainians who are going to end up living there, right? And it's not going to be great. The last point that I want to make then, though, is the question of responsibility. Who's going to go to trial for this, right? Ukrainians have prosecuted about 25 Russians so far for war crimes. These are low-level perpetrators accused of murder, rape, torture. These are people who were captured on the battlefield, POWs, right? That program is likely to continue. I think we can assume that the numbers involved will grow as the war continues, right? The bigger question is whether or not any higher-ranking Russians, whether they're military officers in high command positions or civilian officials up to and including Vladimir Putin, will stand trial. And there, I think the odds are pretty low, to be perfectly honest, right? The experience of international justice suggests that absent not just military defeat but conquest, most high-level military officials and general staff and above civilian leadership tend not to end up on trial. There are some exceptions. Slobodan Milosevic did end up getting turned over by the Serbian state to stand trial before the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And that was a deal that was made in order to release a lot of development aid for Serbia that was war-torn and was a deeply impoverished country. There was already, Milosevic had already been ousted from power, so there was already, effectively regime change. The only conceivable path to high-ranking Russians facing trial for their crimes would entail some kind of regime change in Russia. I'm not an expert on the internal politics of Russia. I don't have any strong opinions one way or the other about how likely that is. But I do think that even if that happens, the evidence that I've seen right now suggests that the people who would take power after Putin are probably even further to his right, and would be, pretty unlikely to want to turn him over to an international court. What you might see is something like what happened with President Assad of Sudan, where he was prosecuted for corruption in Sudanese courts and is in jail, and they've been promising for years that they were going to turn him over to The Hague to stand trial, and he's still in Khartoum, right? And so I don't think we're likely to see major trials for top Russians. It is true that Ukraine has used its prerogatives under international law to grant the International Criminal Court jurisdiction over the conflict in Ukraine, and there is an ongoing investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor in The Hague into Russian war crimes, both these kinds of on-the-ground, relatively low-level crimes, but also some of these higher-level systemic crimes that I've pointed to. We might well see indictments at some point down the road from the ICC in this regard, but again, I think the odds that anybody's actually going to end up in a Dutch prison from among the kind of the higher levels of the Russian leadership are probably pretty slim. And then the last sort of observation that I would want to make is the question of what that means in terms of thinking about the peace process that hopefully will eventually emerge here at some point, right? And on the one hand, I think that there's an argument that has been made, that I have made in print, which is that international indictments can be actually harmful to peace negotiations, right? Because they give perpetrators, especially elite level government officials, an incentive to keep fighting, rather than, if surrender or peace or losing a war means prison, that's a relatively strong incentive to continue fighting, right? So that's one risk for sure of, I think, especially the ICC process, right? And if the Office of the Prosecutor does eventually get around to issuing indictments, that's a potential downside, right? On the other hand, if you use that as a negotiating chip, right, it has the potential, I think, to be useful, right? One of the things that you can offer is that we will not enforce, arrest warrants. We will not, we will get the ICC, the UN has the Security Council has the authority to suspend ICC investigations, right? That would obviously take unanimity on the Security Council, but that's something that you could offer as part of a negotiating position in any peace talks that come out. How much that would really sway anyone is an open question, again, because if I'm Vladimir Putin, I'm really not worried about seeing me inside of the Dutch jail, right? And so I don't know that that's much of a negotiating incentive, but it's an option, right? I also do think, though, that there is likely to be large-scale and ongoing projects of international justice that will play out over coming decades, at least for sort of mid to low-level perpetrators. We see this, ongoing with, say, perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide, who periodically get arrested in Belgium or in Texas or in various parts around places around the world where they've emigrated and end up on trial for their crimes back in the 90s. I suspect something like that is likely to happen over the coming decades, coming out of the Russian conflict. And that's where I will wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank all our panelists for very thought-provoking presentations. And I guess, we have about 20 minutes, so maybe, if maybe you'd like to respond to each other's presentations first, and then we can open the floor for, or just take questions from the others. Okay, all right. So, yeah.
So my question is specifically targeted at the two historians on the panel, but please feel free, everyone else, to give their opinion. And my question is about this weaponization of history, but not in the context of the way Putin has recognized history, but the weaponization of history as it is perceived in the United States currently. And I'm going to give 2 examples of what I have seen in conversations with people that are Putin apologists, whether on the left or the right. On the right, I've heard people saying, you know, the Nazis are bad, but they had a point. You know, the bombing of Dresden was really bad. Just recently, state-sponsored Russian Twitter just said how bad it was that that we bombed Dresden, even though we were on the same side at that time. But beside the point, it's like this revisionism of we were the bad guys in World War II. This is coming from the right. We were the bad guys in World War II. And then on the left, you have this, I would say it's revisionism of the Yugoslav wars and how the bad NATO people were, you know, they bombed the genocidal Serbians who were proudly ethnically cleansing Bosnians in their own words, and who today are celebrated by white nationalists who commit shootings. So I see this kind of like this weaponization in the United States, and so please feel free for the political scientists to also comment on this in like our culture here. Well, what do you think of that? Like, do you think that has kind of like an effect on like how history is going to be portrayed in the future, in the sense of like Florida is banning all these books, and you know the humanities are being cut left and right across the country? It's kind of a scary time.
Nicole, do you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Use the microphone, Nicole.
Oh, I get all the shout. No? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
I think this is a great question, and this is what motivated my contribution tonight, which is I think that it's fascinating. On one hand, history's always been debatable and always been used by multiple parties for different purposes. It's not changing. What's changing is, at the risk of sounding very banal, our social media landscape means many, many more people are involved than even 15 years ago in these conversations. And we're also experiencing globally, but in the US in particular, a decline of the cult of the expert. A sort of belief in expertise and scientific rationality and in some expert holding an opinion that we should value. Across the medical sciences, science in general, you know, not just about politics. And so those two things are interrelated. I think the reason that the stakes are ever higher, because as more and more people are participating on social media and are forming strong opinions, they are also influencing policy and influencing the kinds of conversations that are had. And it really is a time when historical literacy is all the more important, or just liberal arts education in general, not just history, is all the more important, and yet all the further off, you know, all the more elusive the grasp, the kinds of conversations we're having tonight, where Professor Easter can hold in one conversation NATO responsibility and Russian imperial sort of designs, and hold those in tension without saying one is 100% true and one is 100% false, but that this is multifactorial. That kind of complexity, we don't have the space for it on the internet right now, and we don't have the attentions for it right now, and we don't have the cultural context, most of us, who are now participating in these conversations. And I don't mean that as an elitist, but I mean that I do worry about the kinds of spaces we can hold. And so I speak German, Russian, and Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian, Macedonian Serbian, as it's often called, or Montenegrin Serbian, as it's often called, because I'm married to someone who's a product of sort of a Bosnian Serbian ancestry. And so I sort of speak the languages of nationalistic empires who often sort of go out and act nastily in the imperial space. And so I have a great affinity with these places and with the sort of the languages of NATO expansion being dangerous, you know? And so I think it's important for us to be able to entertain the perspectives of other powers that are not the US, and not always ally ourselves with the U.S. state actions as being noble and pure and good on the one hand, but not succumb to binary thinking where we assume that the other side is right. Well, the U.S. is an awful actor always and everywhere, you know, and to be able to entertain both and to be able to think about what states do on the international stage and how they are motivated by those powers. And I'm speaking outside of my
purview because that sounds more like political science. But I think that's part of what our liberal arts education does, but I'm really worried that it's not part of what our ability to have conversations digitally now is doing.
Other questions?
Can I actually respond super fast to that really quickly? Because the question was directed to two historians. I don't think you have to think that the United States is, pure as the driven snow in order to recognize that, Russia's actions were driven by Russia's own political decision-making process, right? And has the United States behaved badly in the history of the world? Yes, right? But there's an important moral lesson that I learned as a fairly young child. Two wrongs don't make a right, right? And whether or not the United States, behaved badly in bombing Dresden, yes, they did, right? Whether they behaved badly in bombing Serbia, I'm far less convinced of that case, right? But either way, neither of those statements, even if completely true, does anything to affect the legality, the morality, or the wisdom of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Let me also add something. Just apropos of what both Nicole and Devin talked about, but specifically, remember, people who weaponize history usually count on the audience not having long and deep memory. And one of the problems in this conflict is that there is historical amnesia on all sides. And let's face it, there is a lot of historical amnesia in modern Ukraine. And I'm not saying that's the main reason for the conflict, but it's one of the reasons for why the conflict is often misinterpreted by those who, as you put it, weaponize history. To give you one example, which again is brought up, for the history of ethnic Ukrainians collaborating with the Nazis and their allies in World War II. Of course, it's not just that it's being obliterated and obfuscated and partially heroized in the post-Soviet Ukraine, but also it is the subject of great amnesia. History knows that after the Nazi invasion and the surrender of millions of Soviet Red Army troops in Ukraine particularly, the Nazis practiced different attitudes towards ethnic Ukrainians and other members of the Soviet armed forces. History also knows that the highest number of camp guards were ethnic Ukrainians. But it does not mean that the Russian pathetic, absurd rhetoric of denazifying Ukraine today has any validity, because that was, and I say this as someone whose direct ancestors died in the Shoah, in the occupied Soviet territories. So I say this with all the responsibility. It does not mean that we should buy into those crude attempts to weaponize history by making a connection between what was in 1941, 42, 43, 44, and what is happening today. We must precisely oppose them because we know when it happened and when it did not happen. Thank you.
Yes, I think we have a question here. Yeah.
I mean, maybe they should use a microphone, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. Let's give them a microphone.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you all very much. Say that this Seymour Hersh story is true, and by no means do we know that it is, but it seems pretty spectacular that we would have handicapped German infrastructure in the long term, no more cheap, dependable natural gas. What does that world look like? I don't know if we care to speculate on that. What does that world look like, and what does the future of war look like, if that's true?
Well, I think it's for you too. I think because it's a war crime, isn't it?
You said it.
Thank Thank you, Nicole. In my opinion, and it's only an opinion, if the story is shown to be true, I don't think there will be, in the short term and probably in the medium term, much a reaction to it. And in the longer term, if it's true, the resentment that it's likely to generate could be something that undermines Germany's place in NATO, or at least in the present conflict. Although, given the German leadership at the moment, that is something you wouldn't expect to see. That would be short term. That's the short term. If it's shown to be true, it'll be something that future generations will look back on and say, the United States does some terrible things. For example, 20 years ago, they blew up the German access to gas. And maybe it will never be proven anyway. Sweden's in charge of the investigation and as of now won't share any information with Germany.
Any question?
Yeah, so, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, let's maybe, we have time for maybe one more question. One more question. Let's keep it civil, yes.
Yeah, I hope it was less conversation, maybe more simplified answers. So when Putin in his State of the Nation address said that he was suspending Russia's agreement to the New START nuclear arms treaty, who do you think he was attempting to thwart off from acting? What do you think that he was attempting to thwart off? And what do you think is most likely to result from his suspension of Russia's involvement?
I have some thoughts on that.
Good, because I didn't hear it. Max and I were arguing.
She was asking about Putin's suspension of New START. So yeah, so I have some thoughts, and then Jerry, if you want to jump in. I mean, that was very clearly a message for the United States, right? You know, he is attempting to put a lot of diplomatic pressure on the U.S. He said, "I'm suspending it. You know, if the U.S. and NATO change their behavior, I'm willing to rejoin." Right. So it's clearly a kind of diplomatic pressure tactic. Right. He's playing to forces in the United States that are already skeptical of American support for Ukraine, who are already inclined to argue that a negotiated settlement is better sooner rather than later, that the United States should pressure Ukraine into making, you know, more or less whatever concessions are necessary to secure an immediate ceasefire. So, you know, it's both about kind of putting pressure on the Americans, and especially on the Biden administration, because Biden is quite concerned, I think, about the risk of nuclear escalation in particular, and he's trying to thread that needle. But it's also about you know, giving more rhetorical, symbolic capital to people in the U.S. who are already skeptical of the American support for the war, and who can then, you know, come on and say, well, you know, we're risking nuclear war for Kiev, and that's silly, and yet, right, and so it's you know, in the long run, could it lead to a renewed nuclear arms race? Maybe, but he's already said he's actually going to abide by the restrictions in New START. He's just suspending the inspections, right? So, you know, what it means in 5 or 10 years, kind of, I think is, at this point, it's hard to say. I don't read it as actually increasing the risk of nuclear war, personally. I think that, you know, deterrence is still a thing, right? The logic of deterrence hasn't changed fundamentally in the last, you know, 12 months. And so I see this as a diplomatic move. I don't see this as actually any kind of particular strategic threat of increasing the risk of nuclear war.
Okay, I agree with almost everything that you said. That it's a ploy. I think not a committed policy, and that action unto itself doesn't have a consequence for the likelihood of nuclear war. But the part that I disagreed with was I thought it was a bit casual about brushing off the prospects of a renewed arms race. I think the prospects of a renewed arms race are actually quite good. It's a good time to invest in military industry. It's a good time to invest in American liquefied natural gas. Anyways, the casualness about that, or that this conflict could reach a point at which a nuclear weapon is used, maybe a tactical, a battlefield-style nuclear weapon, which is meant to extinguish all the humans and life around, but will keep everything else sustainable in the near future. We've already entered a phase in which nobody thought we would be. I think I agree with those that the war unfolded and that it's a year old surprises Putin as much as anybody else. And the U.S. Putin amassed the forces. He demanded a security deal on Ukraine, and the U.S. dared him to go to war because they weren't going to provide him with one. And that was his tough luck. And Putin said, okay, I'll go to war. And so begins a process that I think most actors thought was not going to happen. Certainly Zelensky didn't. I think a lot of the U.S. Officials didn't. They thought he would back down, although then it becomes an opportunity to apply the policy recommendations of the RAND Report 2019 extending Russia. Oh, it's on the internet. It's easy to find. So I wouldn't be casual about expanding it. What's going to happen when the new round of weapons are obliterated by Russian artillery and Ukraine starts to lose more manpower? What's going to happen then? Then's going to come the regional war and Poles and Romanians, and what's going to happen after that? And what if China gets involved? And then there's World War III. So it's all, oh, but that's not really going to happen. That's just unthinkable. And the actors will come to their senses. But here we are a year later.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll probably have to wind things up here. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists.